The night was quiet, yet alive with the subtle hum of Guadalajara's late 1980s streets. Beyond the gates of a grand mansion, a man stood by an open window, his silhouette framed by the faint glow of a single lamp. Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo, known to his friends and enemies alike as El Padrino, the Godfather, watched the city lights shimmer like scattered jewels across the dark valley. To the world outside, he was a respectable businessman, a man who moved with quiet dignity, never raising his voice, never drawing attention. But those who whispered his name in hushed tones knew the truth. This was the architect of Mexico's first true drug empire, the man who turned a scattered network of smugglers into a single, powerful federation that would forever change the underworld. The air outside was warm, heavy with the scent of dust and jacaranda trees in bloom. Inside, the room was still, almost reverent, as if aware of the man's gravity. Gallardo's presence was calm yet commanding. He was not a man of rash words or flamboyant gestures. Unlike the brash, flashy drug lords who would later dominate headlines, he preferred subtlety. His suits were impeccably tailored but never ostentatious, his manner polite but guarded, his empire run more like a boardroom than a battlefield. He believed in order, in structure, in control, principles that would make him both respected and feared. It is hard to imagine, standing in this quiet moment, that the man at the window had built an empire stretching from the marijuana fields of Sinaloa to the cocaine pipelines of Colombia, with safe passage through every major route north to the United States. It is harder still to imagine that the calm figure staring into the night would soon face the full force of two governments, his carefully crafted network splintering beneath him, his allies betraying him one by one. For now, though, the world was silent, and his mind was fixed on the empire he had worked so carefully to create. The story of Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo is not merely the story of a man, it is the story of a turning point in history. Before him, Mexico's traffickers were small-time ranchers and smugglers, each guarding their own routes, competing, fighting, losing to law enforcement as often as they succeeded. After him, there was a system, a centralized, disciplined cartel that could negotiate with Colombia's meddling traffickers as equals, that could bribe politicians and police at the highest levels, that could move tons of narcotics with near-military efficiency. Gallardo was not just a trafficker, he was a strategist, a visionary who saw what others did not. In his mind, this was not crime, it was business. And business was booming. But business carried risks, and Gallardo understood them well. He knew that every empire invites challengers, that every alliance eventually frays. Somewhere deep inside, perhaps he sensed the future, the betrayals, the manhunts, the prison cell where he would one day spend decades of his life. Perhaps, standing at that window, he wondered whether the order he had imposed on Mexico's underworld could ever truly last, or whether the seeds of chaos were already planted in the very system he had built. The streets of Guadalajara outside his window told their own story. The city had become a heaven for traffickers under his watch, a place where deals were struck in quiet restaurants, where shipments were arranged over dinner and sealed with a handshake. At night, the city hummed with wealth, luxury cars, fine suits, the subtle blending of legitimate businessmen and underworld figures. To the casual observer, it looked like prosperity. To Gallardo, it was the result of careful balance, an arrangement that could collapse if one piece fell out of place. There is something almost poetic about the stillness of this moment. It is the stillness before a storm, the quiet breath before a great unraveling. For those listening now, perhaps lying in bed, eyes half closed, the story you are about to hear will take you on a journey. Through dusty ranches and bustling border towns, through opulent mansions and shadowed safe houses. It will lead you into courtrooms and prison cells, through moments of triumph and moments of crushing defeat. But it begins here, with a man alone at a window, reflecting on a world he shaped with his own hands. Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo's name has become legend, surrounded by myth and fear. Some call him a criminal mastermind, others a necessary evil, a man who brought discipline to an unruly trade. The truth, as always, is somewhere in between. He was at once a visionary and a man bound by the same flaws as those he led. He sought control in a world defined by chaos, yet in seeking it, he unleashed forces that even he could not contain. Tonight, as we begin this story, let us slow down and walk through the life of the man they called El Padrino. Let us hear the footsteps he left on the dusty roads of Sinaloa, feel the tension of the boardrooms where deals were struck, and sense the weight of the choices that led him here, to this quiet night, to this reflection. Because to understand the cartels of today, to understand the violence and power struggles that shape Mexico's present, we must first understand the man who set the template. This is the rise, the rule, and the fall of the godfather of Mexico's drug empire. And it all begins with a whisper, with the flicker of a city's lights in the darkness, and with a man who believed he could bring order to the underworld, if only for a time. In the dusty heart of Sinaloa, long before the world would know his name, a boy named Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo was born into a place that seemed untouched by time. Bella Vista, his hometown, was small, quiet, and poor, its streets lined with simple adobe houses and the smell of earth after rain. Life here moved slowly. The mornings were filled with the sounds of roosters and the rustle of wind through the cornfields, and the nights were still enough that one could hear the faint croak of frogs near the irrigation canals. In this quiet world, Miguel's story began, not as the feared godfather of an empire, but as a child running barefoot along dirt roads, chasing after a future he could not yet imagine. Miguel grew up in a family that, like so many in rural Mexico, knew the meaning of hard work. The fields were both a blessing and a burden, providing food but demanding endless labor under the blazing sun. He was not born into wealth or privilege, and that fact would shape him deeply. Neighbors remembered him as polite and intelligent, a boy who kept to himself but carried an unusual air of determination. Even in his youth, he had a certain discipline, a seriousness beyond his years, as if he already sensed that his path would take him far beyond Bella Vista's borders. School was one of Miguel's few escapes from the monotony of rural life. Though education was limited in small towns at the time, he applied himself with quiet diligence, developing the sharp mind that would one day make him a master strategist. Teachers noticed that he was curious about the wider world, asking questions not just about lessons but about how things worked, why some men held power while others struggled to survive, why some families lived well while others barely made it through each harvest. Those early questions would follow him into adulthood, growing into an ambition that could not be contained by a simple farming life. The Sinaloa of Miguel's childhood was a place of contrasts. On the one hand, it was beautiful green fields stretching toward the horizon, mountains rising in the distance, the sea not far away. On the other, it was harsh and unforgiving. Droughts could destroy a season's crops. Poverty was a constant companion. Many young men, frustrated by the lack of opportunity, turned to smuggling as a way to survive. In those days, It was often just a few sacks of marijuana carried across the border, hidden under loads of produce or strapped to the backs of mules. Miguel would have seen this life all around him, but at first, his focus was elsewhere. He sought stability, respectability, perhaps a way to rise without falling into crime. For him, that path would be law enforcement. Becoming a police officer was no small thing for a boy from a rural town. It required leaving behind family and the slow rhythm of Bella Vista, moving toward the busier, more dangerous world of cities like Culiacan and later Guadalajara. But Miguel had ambition, and ambition thrives on risk. The uniform gave him more than a job, it gave him authority, a way to stand straighter, to command respect. It was during these early years, as a member of the Federal Judicial Police, that he began to glimpse the machinery of power and perhaps more importantly, the cracks within it. In Bella Vista, rules had seemed simple: work hard, respect your elders, keep your word. In law enforcement, Miguel discovered a different reality. He saw firsthand how justice could be bent, how the right bribe could make problems disappear, how the line between the law and the lawbreakers was thinner than anyone admitted. These experiences did not make him bitter, they made him observant. He learned who held real power, and it wasn't always the men with badges. It was the ones who could buy protection, the ones who had the money to make the system work for them. In this way, the seed of an idea was planted. If he could understand this system, he could use it. But before that seed would grow into the empire he later commanded, Miguel still carried something of Bella Vista within him, a sense of discipline, a preference for order over chaos. Unlike the future cartel bosses, who would flash gold chains and boast of their exploits, Miguel's early life taught him the value of discretion. He had seen what poverty looked like, had seen what desperation drove men to do, and he knew that survival depended on staying one step ahead, not on inviting attention. At night, when he returned to Bella Vista to visit his family, he might have walked through the familiar streets with a different gaze. The fields that once seemed endless now looked small. The town that had once been his entire world now felt like the starting point of a much longer journey. There was pride in having come this far, but also a restless energy, the feeling that he was meant for something greater. He was no longer just a boy from Sinaloa. He was becoming a man with a plan. In these early years, nothing about Miguel screamed future kingpin. He was quiet, thoughtful, even soft-spoken. But those who paid attention noticed his ability to organize, to think ahead, to make connections that others missed. He began to build relationships, not just with fellow officers, but with people on the other side of the law. He listened more than he spoke, learned more than he revealed. And slowly, the world began to open before him. By the time Miguel left his rural roots behind for good, he was no longer just chasing opportunity, he was shaping it. The boy from Bella Vista had grown into a man who understood that power was not just about strength but about networks, about trust, about knowing when to move and when to wait. These lessons, forged in the quiet fields of his childhood and sharpened in the corridors of police stations, would serve him well in the years to come. For now, though, his story is still one of beginnings. The dusty roads of Bella Vista are still fresh in his memory, the lessons of family and hard work still guiding him. But beyond the horizon, the world of traffickers and smugglers, of secret alliances and dangerous deals, is waiting. Soon, Miguel would take his first steps into that world, not as a reckless outlaw, but as a man who believed he could bring structure to a chaotic trade. And as we follow him into the next chapter of his life, we will see how the boy who once dreamed of a better future became the man who built an empire that changed Mexico forever. The badge gleamed under the sun, a small symbol of authority pinned neatly to the chest of a young man who carried himself with quiet confidence. Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo had left behind the sleepy streets of Bella Vista and stepped into a world of uniforms, patrols, and the weight of responsibility. For a boy from rural Sinaloa, becoming a federal judicial police officer was not just a job, it was a transformation. The first time he wore the uniform, he felt the shift. People treated him differently. Shopkeepers nodded with respect, neighbors greeted him with pride, and strangers looked twice, sensing that this was a man who now held power in his hands. The early years in law enforcement were filled with routine. Long days under the heat, stopping vehicles on dusty roads, taking statements from farmers, mediating disputes, and ensuring that the rules of the state were followed, at least in theory. Miguel was meticulous, taking his role seriously, earning a reputation for discipline and intelligence. Yet even as he carried out his duties with quiet professionalism, he began to notice something unsettling. The rules he had been sworn to uphold were not applied equally to everyone. It began with small things. A truck driver who should have been fined was quietly waved through after handing over an envelope. A prisoner who should have faced charges was suddenly released because someone powerful had made a call. Miguel watched and learned, not with outrage but with interest. In Bella Vista, power had seemed simple: elders, priests, landowners. In the cities, power was layered, complex, and often invisible. The police were not just enforcers of the law, they were part of a larger system where favors, money, and influence dictated outcomes. It was during these years that Miguel became a bodyguard for Leopoldo Sánchez Celis, the governor of Sinaloa. This position changed everything. No longer just another officer, he now moved in the circles of politicians, businessmen, and high-ranking officials. He attended events in elegant salons, guarded meetings in government offices, and listened quietly as decisions were made that affected entire regions. He learned the art of silence, the ability to hear secrets and keep them locked away. And he learned something else: power did not flow from the badge alone. It flowed from relationships, from knowing who could be trusted, who could be bought, and who needed to be feared. The governor's inner circle gave Miguel a front row seat to the machinery of the state. He saw that corruption was not an exception, it was the glue that held the system together. Bribes were not viewed as crimes, but as transactions, part of an unspoken understanding that made the wheels turn. For a man as observant as Miguel, this was not discouraging. It was enlightening. If the system could be bent, then it could also be used. And if one was clever enough, it could be used not just for survival, but for advancement. At night, when the streets were quiet, Miguel would sometimes think back to the boy he had been in Bella Vista, the boy who believed that law enforcement was about protecting the innocent. Now he understood that innocence was a luxury. The real world was a chessboard, and every move counted. His role was no longer simply to follow orders, but to navigate this board carefully, to stay useful to those in power while quietly building a position of his own. The contacts Miguel made during these years would prove invaluable. He met men who controlled smuggling routes, men who could move marijuana and opium past the watchful eyes of border patrols, men who had grown wealthy by simply paying the right people to look the other way. At first, Miguel's role was limited to protection. ensuring that certain shipments reached their destination, that certain people were not harassed. But as time went on, he began to see the bigger picture. These were not isolated operations, they were part of an emerging network, a network that could become far more powerful if someone with vision could organize it. There was something in Miguel's character that made him different from many of his peers. Other officers were content to take bribes, to drink away their wages, to live in the moment. Miguel was careful, calculating. He saved his money, invested in land, and cultivated a reputation for reliability. He was not loud, not flashy, but those who dealt with him knew that he kept his word. In a world where betrayal was common, that quality made him stand out. The disillusionment that other young officers might have felt did not sour Miguel. Instead, it sharpened him. If the system was corrupt, then one had to learn to play the game better than anyone else. If loyalty could be bought, then he would learn the price and pay it when necessary. If justice could be bent, then he would bend it in his favor. The boy from Sinaloa was slowly disappearing, replaced by a man who understood power not as an abstract idea but as a tool to be wielded. By the end of his years in law enforcement, Miguel had built a quiet but formidable network of contacts. He knew which commanders could be counted on to provide cover, which politicians could be approached for favors, which smugglers were reliable partners. And he knew that this network was worth more than any badge. The badge could be taken away, but trust, once earned, could open doors that no uniform ever could. The last days of his police career carried with them a sense of inevitability. He had gone as far as he could within the official structure. The next step, the real step, would take him outside the law. But Miguel was not reckless. He did not rush. He waited, planned, and positioned himself carefully, like a chess player preparing for a decisive move. The world was changing, and Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo was ready to change with it. Somewhere deep inside, he must have known that the life ahead would not be simple. Power attracts enemies as surely as it attracts followers. The road he was about to take would lead him to riches, influence, and respect, but also to betrayal, manhunts, and prison cells. Yet at this point in his story, standing at the threshold between duty and ambition, Miguel was calm. He had seen the truth of the system, had learned its secrets, and was ready to use them. The law had given him his education. Now, it was time to step beyond it and begin building something far greater than anything the boy from Bella Vista could have dreamed. Opportunity rarely knocks loudly. More often, it whispers, appearing as a chance meeting, a favor exchanged, a quiet conversation in the back room of a restaurant. For Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo, the whispers began in the form of introductions, first one smuggler, then another, each connected by invisible threads that stretched across Sinaloa and beyond. What began as routine protection work soon became something else entirely. Miguel was no longer just an officer offering safe passage for a fee, he was becoming the man who could connect the right people at the right time, a broker of trust in a world that thrived on secrecy. The drug trade in the late 1970s was still fractured, more a collection of rival clans and small-time growers than a unified organization. Marijuana and opium poppies grew in the fertile mountains of Sinaloa, Durango, and Chihuahua, tended by farmers who had been doing it for generations. Smuggling was a family affair, routes guarded by brothers and cousins, deals sealed with handshakes, and disputes settled with bullets if necessary. For decades, this had been the way of things, small operators fighting for survival, constantly evading the authorities and each other. But Miguel saw the inefficiency of it all. To him, it was chaos that begged for order. His first alliances were modest. He built relationships with ranchers who controlled growing fields, offering them something they had never truly had before: stability. In exchange for loyalty and a share of the profits, he ensured that law enforcement pressure remained minimal, that shipments moved smoothly, that violence was kept to a minimum. Farmers who once feared losing entire crops to raids now had protection. Smugglers who once fought over routes now had someone to mediate disputes. It was not yet an empire, but the foundations were being quietly laid. Miguel's strength was not brute force but vision. He understood that the trade could be scaled, organized like a business, with each piece working toward a common goal. He also understood that relationships mattered as much as money. A trafficker could buy loyalty with cash, but it was Miguel's reputation for fairness and reliability that kept people coming back to him. He was not seen as just another corrupt cop. He was seen as a man who kept his word, who thought long-term, who wanted everyone under his umbrella to profit. That kind of thinking was rare, and it drew ambitious men toward him. One of the first significant figures to take notice of Miguel was Ernesto Fonseca Carrillo, known simply as Don Nato. Older, experienced, and respected in the smuggling world, Fonseca saw in Miguel a young man with potential, a man who could organize routes and handle delicate negotiations. Their early conversations were cautious, respectful. Miguel listened more than he spoke, learning from Don Nato's years of experience, understanding the complexities of moving product across borders without attracting too much attention. Slowly, trust formed between them, and with that trust came opportunity. Through Don Nato, Miguel's world widened. He met Rafael Caro Quintero, a brash and ambitious young trafficker with a knack for innovation. Caro Quintero was the kind of man who thought in terms of scale. Where others saw small fields, he saw the potential for massive plantations, industry-level production that could flood the American market with marijuana. Together, these three men, Miguel, Don Nato, and Caro Quintero, began to imagine something greater than themselves, something that had never been done before in Mexico. It was the first spark of what would become the Guadalajara Cartel. But before the cartel could be born, Miguel had to prove himself. He handled logistics for increasingly larger shipments, coordinated payments to ensure that police and politicians looked the other way, and smoothed over conflicts that might have escalated into bloodshed. He was careful, deliberate, always thinking 2 steps ahead. Violence, when it came, was swift and quiet, never sloppy. Miguel preferred diplomacy, but he understood that fear had its uses. The goal was not chaos but order, and sometimes order had to be enforced. Word of Miguel's skill spread quietly through the underworld. He was not flashy, not the kind of man who boasted about his power. In fact, his low profile made him even more effective. Those who dealt with him found that he was predictable in the best way. He paid on time, honored agreements, and did not draw unnecessary attention. He was, in many ways, the perfect middleman until he became something more. The more networks he connected, the clearer it became that he was no longer just a participant in the trade. He was beginning to shape it. These years were filled with long nights and careful planning. In safe houses and quiet ranches, Miguel would sit with his partners, maps spread out before them, plotting routes, calculating profits, discussing which officials needed to be paid and which rivals needed to be neutralized. There was a sense among them that they were on the verge of something historic, that they were not just smugglers but builders, laying the groundwork for a system that could endure. And yet, there was danger at every turn. One mistake, one betrayal, could bring the whole operation crashing down. The police were not always reliable, and the Americans were watching with growing interest as more and more drugs flowed north. Miguel understood that their survival depended on discretion. They could grow, yes, but not too fast, not too loudly. Every move had to be calculated, every risk weighed carefully. The boy from Bella Vista, who once patrolled dusty roads with a badge, was now orchestrating something far more dangerous and far more lucrative. In the stillness of those early mornings, as he prepared for another day of negotiations and covert planning, Miguel must have felt a strange mix of pride and anticipation. He was no longer merely reacting to events, he was directing them. He was becoming the man that others relied on, the one who could bring order where there had been only rivalry and bloodshed. The seeds of an empire had been planted, and though they were still hidden beneath the soil, they were beginning to take root. Looking back, it is clear that these first connections were the turning point. Without them, Miguel might have remained a well-connected ex-police officer, respected but ordinary. With them, he was set on a path that would change not only his life but the entire landscape of organized crime in Mexico. The alliances he forged in these quiet years would become the backbone of the Guadalajara Cartel, and the system he envisioned would soon transform the drug trade into something bigger, something far more powerful than anyone had ever seen. For now, though, the story remains in this moment of quiet construction, of careful trust-building and secret meetings. The world had not yet heard the name of the Guadalajara Cartel. The Americans had not yet felt the full force of its operations. The betrayals and manhunts and bloody wars were still far in the future. There was only the quiet ambition of a man who believed he could bring order to a chaotic trade and the first steps of a journey that would lead him to the top of Mexico's underworld. The dawn of a new era does not always arrive with fanfare. Sometimes it begins quietly, in ranch houses hidden deep in the countryside, in whispered conversations and late-night strategy sessions. In the late 1970s, those quiet meetings were shaping something unprecedented. Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo, along with Ernesto Don Neto Fonseca Carrillo and Rafael Caro Quintero, had moved beyond casual partnerships. Together, they were about to create something Mexico had never seen before, a fully organized, centralized drug trafficking syndicate, the Guadalajara Cartel. The idea was simple but revolutionary. Instead of rival families and gangs fighting over routes, instead of constant bloodshed draining profits and attracting unwanted attention, they would unite the operations under a single umbrella. They would pool resources, share intelligence, protect one another, and ensure that everyone along the chain, from the growers in the mountains to the smugglers crossing the border, had a role to play. It was a business model disguised as an underworld alliance, and it promised to make them not just rich, but untouchable. Miguel was the architect of this vision. His mind worked like that of a strategist, seeing the trade not as a series of random deals but as a system that could be shaped and controlled. Don Neto brought wisdom and experience, a steady hand that helped keep hot-headed rivals in check. And Caro Quintero brought daring and ambition, the willingness to experiment with new methods, new plantations, new ways of moving product on a scale no one had attempted before. Together, they formed a triangle of power, one calculating, one steady, one bold, and that combination proved unstoppable. Their first major move was to consolidate control of trafficking routes through Guadalajara, a city that was strategically perfect. It was far from the watchful eyes of American border patrols, well connected by highways, and large enough to blend in but small enough to manage. The city became their headquarters, the place where shipments were received, processed, and directed northward. From here, Miguel could oversee operations with the precision of a CEO, holding meetings in quiet homes, coordinating bribes to police and military officials, and ensuring that the organization remained invisible to outsiders. Violence, which had once been the defining feature of the trade, was minimized under their leadership. Disputes that might once have ended in bloody shootouts were now handled through negotiation. Miguel preferred to solve problems with money rather than bullets. This was part of his genius. He understood that stability was good for business. A dead rival could trigger a feud, a paid-off rival could become a partner. And so, little by little, the region's traffickers fell in line, some willingly, some reluctantly, until the cartel held effective control of most major routes through western Mexico. At the heart of this consolidation was trust, but trust backed by strength. Those who worked with Miguel knew that he honored agreements, but they also knew that betrayal would not be tolerated. In a world where double crosses were common, this combination of fairness and firmness created a sense of predictability. Under Miguel's watch, profits soared. Marijuana flowed north in unprecedented quantities, and for the first time, the trade began to resemble an industry rather than a series of outlaw operations. One of the most audacious moves of this new organization was the creation of massive marijuana plantations. Caro Quintero spearheaded this effort, most famously with the Rancho Buffalo project, a staggering operation hidden in the deserts of Chihuahua, covering thousands of acres and employing hundreds of workers. It was industrial farming on a scale no one had seen before, producing tons of high-quality product destined for the United States. The operation was so large that it required coordination with local officials, police, and even military units to keep it protected. Miguel's network made that possible, weaving a shield of corruption around the enterprise so complete that it operated in plain sight. Guadalajara itself changed under the weight of this new wealth. Mansions rose in quiet neighborhoods, restaurants filled with well-dressed men speaking in hushed tones, and money began to flow into legitimate businesses, construction companies, nightclubs, even banks. To outsiders, it might have looked like a boomtown, a city enjoying a wave of prosperity. But beneath the surface, the cartels hand-guided much of this growth, investing profits in ways that laundered money and tightened their control over the region. Even as the organization grew, Miguel insisted on discipline. Meetings were run like corporate gatherings, with clear agendas and strict protocols. He discouraged unnecessary violence, keeping a lid on impulsive acts that might draw attention. Those who broke the rules were dealt with swiftly, not as an act of revenge but as a way to maintain order. He saw himself not as a gangster but as a businessman, one who happened to operate outside the law. To him, the difference was merely technical. The goal was efficiency, profitability, and above all, control. Yet this calm order carried within it the seeds of future conflict. The very act of centralizing power meant that the cartel had become a single point of failure. If the government or foreign agencies ever managed to strike at the heart of the organization, the entire network could be thrown into chaos. For now, however, that risk seemed distant. Miguel and his partners had friends in high places, and their bribes reached so far that it seemed almost impossible that anyone would dare move against them. The late nights in Guadalajara were filled with planning and quiet celebration. There must have been moments, as Miguel sat with Don Nato and Caro Quintero over glasses of fine tequila, when they allowed themselves to imagine that their system would last forever. They had done what few had thought possible. They had tamed the chaos of Mexico's underworld, imposed a kind of peace, and turned a disorganized trade into a thriving, centralized empire. For a time, it must have seemed as though nothing could stop them. But history has a way of turning quiet triumphs into loud tragedies. The more successful the cartel became, the more attention it attracted, attention from rivals who wanted a piece of the action, from journalists who began asking questions, and most dangerously, from the United States, which was beginning to notice that the flow of drugs had reached unprecedented levels. Somewhere beyond the horizon, trouble was coming. But in this moment, the empire was strong, and its godfather stood at the center of it all, calm, watchful, and certain that he had built something unshakable. There comes a moment in every empire when its borders must expand or risk stagnation. For Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo and his partners, that moment arrived when the first whispers reached them from far beyond Mexico's borders. In Colombia, thousands of miles to the south, a new power was rising, an organization that dwarfed anything Mexico had ever seen. The Medellin Cartel, led by Pablo Escobar, the Oco brothers, and Carlos Lehder, was flooding the United States with cocaine, making fortunes so vast that cash was being buried in fields because banks could no longer hold it. But there was a problem. The Caribbean smuggling routes, which had once been their lifeline, were now under heavy surveillance by the U.S. authorities. The Colombians needed a new route, and Miguel saw an opportunity that would transform his operation forever. The idea was brilliant in its simplicity. Instead of risking interception over the Caribbean, the Colombians would ship their cocaine to Mexico. From there, Miguel's network would take it across the U.S. border using the routes he had already perfected for marijuana. In exchange, Mexico would no longer be just a producer and smuggler of its own drugs, it would take a cut of the profits from Colombian cocaine. This arrangement would make everyone richer, but it required trust, and trust in the underworld is rarely given freely. The first meetings between the Colombians and Miguel's inner circle were tense but polite. Imagine the scene, a secluded ranch house somewhere in Sinaloa or Jalisco, guarded by armed men, the air thick with cigarette smoke and quiet calculation. The Colombians, used to dealing with violent enforcers and unpredictable warlords, must have been surprised by Miguel's calm, businesslike manner. He did not shout, did not threaten. Instead, he listened carefully, asked precise questions, and spoke of logistics as if they were discussing a legitimate import-export deal. He presented Mexico not as a risk, but as a solution, a land bridge that could carry their product safely into the most lucrative market in the world. The deal that emerged from those talks was a turning point. For every shipment of cocaine that passed through Mexico, Miguel and his organization would take a percentage, a tax for safe passage. This arrangement became known as the Plaza System, and it was revolutionary. No longer were traffickers competing violently over routes. Instead, Miguel appointed trusted lieutenants to oversee each region, each plaza, who would pay a share of their earnings back to the central organization. In return, they received protection, access to routes, and the weight of the cartel behind them if trouble arose. It was, in effect, the franchising of organized crime, and it made the Guadalajara Cartel more powerful than ever. Soon, tons of cocaine were flowing through Mexico, and the profits were staggering. The marijuana trade had been lucrative, but cocaine was a different world entirely. A single shipment could bring in millions, and the money began to pour into Guadalajara at a pace that seemed almost unreal. Mansions grew even larger, cars even flashier, and investments spread into nightclubs, hotels, and legitimate businesses. Yet Miguel remained the picture of restraint, preferring tailored suits and quiet dinners to the kind of ostentatious displays that would later define the narco culture. To him, discretion was not just a preference, it was survival. The partnership with the Colombians also changed the cartel's operations. Smuggling now required a higher level of coordination, more secure routes, and stricter discipline. Airstrips were built in remote locations, guarded night and day. Entire convoys moved through the country under the watch of armed escorts. Payments had to be laundered through increasingly complex financial networks, funneled through businesses and banks in Mexico, the United States, and even Europe. Miguel oversaw this expansion like a seasoned executive, delegating tasks but keeping a close watch on every major decision. But with this new wealth came new dangers. The stakes were higher, the shipments riskier, and the pressure from law enforcement greater. The U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration had begun to realize that Mexico was no longer just a source of marijuana, it was now a crucial hub for the cocaine trade. Operations intensified, raids increased, and the DA's presence in Mexico grew. Miguel understood that this was the price of success. The more powerful they became, the more attention they would draw. It was a delicate balance: expand too quickly, and they risked provoking a crackdown; expand too slowly, and someone else would seize the opportunity. Inside the cartel, the deal with Colombia also shifted the balance of power. Those who controlled the cocaine routes became more important than those who merely grew marijuana. Ambitions swelled, rivalries simmered, and though Miguel kept a firm grip on the organization, he must have sensed that unity was fragile. The money being made was enough to tempt even the most loyal men, and loyalty in the underworld is a commodity that must be constantly bought and reinforced. Even so, these were the glory days of the Guadalajara Cartel. Meetings with Colombian representatives became routine, and the flow of product seemed endless. Ranch houses once used for simple gatherings now hosted discussions about shipments worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The men at the table were no longer just traffickers, they were power brokers, dealing with presidents, governors, generals, and businessmen. They had become part of the fabric of Mexico's political and economic life, their influence reaching into places that most citizens would never suspect. Some nights, as Miguel sat in quiet reflection, he must have marveled at how far he had come. The boy who once walked barefoot along the dirt roads of Bella Vista was now at the helm of an operation that linked South America, Mexico, and the United States in a seamless chain. He had achieved what few men ever do. He had created order in a world of chaos, and in doing so, had become indispensable to everyone involved. The Colombians relied on him. His partners relied on him. Even corrupt officials relied on him, their fortunes tied to the smooth continuation of the trade. But as history shows, the higher an empire rises, the more precarious its position becomes. The partnership with Colombia, while immensely profitable, also made Miguel's organization a target of unprecedented importance. To the Americans, stopping the cocaine flood had become a priority, and that meant dismantling the network that made it possible. The DA was watching more closely than ever, gathering intelligence, waiting for the right moment to strike. And within Mexico, jealousies were brewing among traffickers left out of the deal, men who saw Miguel's growing power as a threat to their own ambitions. For now, though, the machine ran smoothly. Planes landed, trucks crossed borders, and money moved quietly through hands and banks like water flowing through hidden channels. The Guadalajara Cartel stood at the center of it all, its reach longer and its grip tighter than anyone had thought possible. The godfather of Mexico's underworld had taken his first step onto the global stage, and the world was beginning to notice. The stage was set for triumph, but also for tragedy, because power on this scale never goes unchallenged for long. At the peak of his power, Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo was a man who seemed almost untouchable. By the early 1980s, the Guadalajara Cartel was not just a criminal organization, it was a shadow government. Routes were secure, plazas were organized, and bribes flowed so efficiently that it felt as if entire regions of Mexico were quietly working for him. If you had stood in Guadalajara during those years, you might never have guessed that behind the city's calm surface, a criminal empire was being directed with precision. There were no gang wars in the streets, no chaotic shootouts in broad daylight. Under Gallardo's watch, the underworld was eerily quiet, almost orderly, like a city under the watchful eye of a silent ruler. Miguel's personal style contributed to that atmosphere of calm. He was not a man who craved attention or indulged in flamboyant displays. While others might have surrounded themselves with gold-plated pistols or thrown wild parties to flaunt their wealth, Miguel preferred the dignity of understatement. He dressed elegantly but simply, often in tailored suits that would not have looked out of place in a boardroom. He spoke softly, rarely raising his voice, and when he gave orders, they were measured, deliberate. Those who worked with him knew that his power was not something that needed to be shouted about, it was felt in every decision, every alliance, every carefully coordinated shipment that crossed the border without incident. Guadalajara, under his influence, began to change. Money from the cartel flowed into legitimate businesses, hotels, nightclubs, ranches, construction companies. The economy boomed, at least for those who were connected. Politicians were seen dining with businessmen who owed their fortunes to the drug trade, and everyone pretended not to notice. The police turned their eyes away from certain trucks and certain houses, and in return, their salaries were supplemented by envelopes that made life more comfortable. The city became a kind of sanctuary, a neutral zone where deals could be struck and disputes resolved without bloodshed. This was Miguel's greatest achievement, not just the scale of his operation, but the order he imposed on a trade that had once been defined by chaos. He believed that violence was bad for business, and he enforced that belief with quiet determination. If two groups had a conflict, he would bring them to the table and mediate a solution. If someone broke the rules, they were dealt with swiftly, but the punishment was precise, targeted, never reckless. In this way, Miguel transformed the drug trade from a series of dangerous rivalries into something resembling a cooperative, with himself as the central figure keeping the balance. Those who met Miguel during this time often described him as charismatic but reserved. There was something magnetic about him, not in a loud or forceful way, but in the quiet confidence he projected. He listened carefully, weighed every word, and when he spoke, it was with the authority of someone who had already thought 3 steps ahead. Even high-ranking politicians treated him with respect, sometimes with a hint of deference. In private, He was known to be gracious, even charming, hosting dinners where business was discussed over good food and fine tequila. To his associates, he was more than just a boss. He was El Padrino, the Godfather, the man who made the whole system work. There must have been moments when Miguel allowed himself to feel pride. The organization he had helped build was functioning like a well-oiled machine. Marijuana production was at record levels, cocaine shipments from Colombia were arriving and being distributed with military precision, and profits were pouring in. Everyone along the chain, from the growers in the mountains to the traffickers in the cities to the officials in their offices, was getting paid. It was, in many ways, a golden age, and Miguel stood at the center of it all, the calm eye of a storm that had not yet broken. But even in these years of apparent tranquility, shadows were lengthening. The more successful the cartel became, the more attention it drew, not just from the Americans, but from Mexican authorities who were under increasing pressure to act. The DEA had begun to take a serious interest in Guadalajara, stationing agents in the city and tracking shipments with greater precision. Operations like Rancho Buffalo were too large to stay hidden forever, and word was beginning to spread that something massive was happening in Mexico. Inside the cartel, too, tensions simmered quietly. Ambitious lieutenants watched Miguel carefully, waiting for signs of weakness, for opportunities to expand their own power. The plaza system he had created gave them autonomy, but with autonomy came ambition. Each plaza chief had his own network of enforcers, his own alliances, his own appetite for profit. For now, they remained loyal, because Miguel's leadership kept profits high and conflict low. But everyone in the room must have known that this unity was fragile, that one major disruption could shatter it. Miguel himself seemed to sense this. He became more cautious, more deliberate. He limited his public appearances, kept his movements discreet, and trusted fewer people with sensitive information. Some said that he rarely traveled without heavy security, though he still maintained an air of calm, as if he refused to let fear dictate his actions. If he felt the growing danger, he did not show it. He was the picture of composure, the businessman who kept everything under control, even as pressure built on all sides. Perhaps the most remarkable thing about this period was the illusion of peace it created. To the average citizen, Guadalajara appeared prosperous and safe. There were no headline-grabbing shootouts, no waves of killings that would later characterize the cartel wars of the 1990s and 2000s. People could dine at restaurants, shop at markets, and go about their lives without sensing that they were living in the heart of one of the most powerful drug empires on earth. This was Miguel's gift, to make the extraordinary look ordinary, to cloak the workings of an international trafficking syndicate in a veil of normalcy. But beneath that veil, something was shifting. The DEA's presence in Mexico was growing, and whispers about an agent named Enrique "Kiki" Camarena were beginning to circulate among Miguel's inner circle. Camarena had been investigating the cartel's operations, getting closer to its secrets than any agent before him. His work would soon collide head-on with Miguel's carefully constructed order, and the result would shake the entire organization to its core. For now, though, the mansion lights in Guadalajara still burned late into the night, as Miguel and his trusted lieutenants planned shipments and discussed strategy over quiet conversations. The empire was at its height, the Godfather firmly in control, the world seemingly at peace. It was a moment of stillness before the storm, a moment when everything seemed secure, and yet, just beyond the horizon, the first cracks in the empire were beginning to form. The quiet order that Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo had worked so hard to create was about to meet its first true test. In the early 1980s, as the United States was intensifying its war on drugs, and Mexico was now firmly on the radar of American authorities. Among the agents sent to uncover the source of the narcotics pouring north was a man whose name would become legend in the story of the Guadalajara Cartel, Enrique Kiki Camarena. Kiki Camarena was not just another DEA agent. Born in Mexico, raised partly in California, he spoke Spanish fluently and understood Mexican culture in a way few of his colleagues did. He was charismatic but tough, with a reputation for persistence and a disarming smile that put people at ease. Camarena had served in the Marines, then as a police officer, before joining the DEA. By the time he was assigned to Guadalajara, he had already built a reputation as an agent who would not give up until he got to the truth. When Camarena arrived in Guadalajara, the city was thriving under the quiet influence of the cartel. To a casual observer, it seemed like a pleasant, modern city, but to Kiki, it was a puzzle waiting to be solved. He began by building relationships, talking to informants, and slowly mapping out the network that Miguel had built. He visited bars, chatted with taxi drivers, and made himself a familiar face in the neighborhoods where cartel activity was rumored to occur. Bit by bit, he started to piece together the scale of the operation. At first, his investigation focused on marijuana. Reports had been coming in of massive plantations hidden in the northern deserts, producing unprecedented quantities of high-grade product. The DA suspected that these were no small-time operations, they were industrial-scale farms feeding the American market. Kiki was determined to find them, and what he uncovered would become one of the most famous discoveries in DEA history. The operation that would bring him to prominence centered on Rancho Buffalo, an enormous marijuana plantation located in Chihuahua. The scale of it was staggering, thousands of acres under cultivation, guarded by armed men, with entire irrigation systems and processing facilities in place. This was not the work of small-time smugglers, this was organized, financed, and protected by someone with immense power. When Mexican authorities, under U.S. pressure, finally raided Rancho Buffalo in 1984, they seized and burned what was estimated to be billions of dollars worth of marijuana. It was the single largest marijuana seizure in history, and it struck at the very heart of Miguel's operation. The raid was a direct blow to the Guadalajara Cartel and to Miguel himself. Not only was it a devastating financial loss, but it also signaled something more dangerous. The Americans were getting closer, and someone inside Mexico had been giving them information. Suspicion began to spread within the cartel. Who had tipped off the authorities? Who had guided them to Rancho Buffalo? Kiki's name started circulating in whispered conversations. He had been seen in the area, asking questions, getting too close. To Miguel's organization, it was clear the DEA agent had become a serious threat. Kiki's work did not stop after Rancho Buffalo. If anything, he pushed harder. He gathered intelligence on the cartel's transportation networks, its money laundering operations, its political connections. He understood that Miguel was not just another trafficker, he was the center of a web that connected growers, smugglers, corrupt officials, and even Colombian suppliers. If that web could be exposed, the entire system might be brought down. The risk to Camarena was enormous. Guadalajara was a city under the cartel's watchful eye, and it was no secret that Miguel's influence extended deep into the police and government. Kiki knew that he was being followed, that his movements were no longer unnoticed. He told colleagues that if anything happened to him, the cartel would be responsible. Friends and family later recalled that he seemed aware of the danger but unwilling to back down. He had come too far, uncovered too much, and he could not simply walk away. For Miguel, Kiki represented more than just a nuisance. He was a symbol of foreign intrusion, a threat to the delicate balance Miguel had maintained for years. The cartel depended on predictability, on control, on being able to move product without interference. Kiki's persistence was not only costing them money but also making them look vulnerable. And in the world Miguel had built, appearing weak was unacceptable. The decision of what to do about Kiki was not taken lightly. There were meetings, discussions, calculations of risk versus reward. To harm an American agent would be to cross a line that no one had dared cross before. It would invite not just local retaliation but international outrage. Yet, from Miguel's perspective, letting Kiki continue his work was not an option. Every day he remained free was another day the cartel's network was at risk of exposure. There must have been nights when Miguel weighed the decision in silence, sitting in one of his quiet rooms, considering what would follow. Violence was something he preferred to avoid, but he had built an empire that relied on discipline. If one man could disrupt everything they had created, what message would it send to others who might try the same? The decision, once made, would be irreversible, a step from which there could be no return. Meanwhile, Kiki continued his work, unaware of just how close he was to the storm that was gathering around him. In the streets of Guadalajara, life went on as usual, the cafes still filled with conversation, the traffic moved through sunlit plazas, and the music still played in the cantinas at night. Yet beneath that surface, a plan was forming, one that would soon lead to one of the most infamous events in the history of the drug war. The tension in these months was almost palpable. On one side stood Miguel, the calm and calculating Godfather, determined to protect what he had built at all costs. On the other stood Kiki, the relentless agent, determined to expose the truth no matter the danger. Their paths had been destined to cross, and now that they had, the confrontation was inevitable. For the moment, the city remained quiet, the calm before the storm. But those who lived through that time later said that something in the air had changed. Conversations were hushed, movements more cautious, as if everyone could sense that something was coming, something that would shatter the illusion of peace and draw the world's attention to Guadalajara. What happened next would not only change the lives of those involved, but would change the course of Mexico's underworld forever. The abduction of Kiki Camarena was no longer just a possibility, it was becoming a plan. And once that plan was set into motion, there would be no going back. The quiet tension that had been building in Guadalajara finally broke. By early 1985, Enrique Kiki Camarena had become too great a threat for Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo and the Guadalajara Cartel to ignore. Every piece of intelligence pointed to the same conclusion: Camarena had not only exposed the Rancho Buffalo operation but was closing in on the very heart of the organization. Each day he remained free, the risk grew that the entire network could be compromised. For Miguel, whose empire was built on control and secrecy, the danger was intolerable. The decision to act was not impulsive. Those close to Miguel later recalled a series of quiet meetings, each one more tense than the last. Voices were kept low, tempers controlled, but the weight of the conversation was unmistakable. To move against an American DEA agent was to cross a line few had dared cross before. It was a decision that could bring the full force of the United States government crashing down upon them. But to do nothing was, in Miguel's mind, to invite disaster. If Camarena was allowed to continue, more raids would follow, more seizures, more arrests. The balance of power could shift overnight. In the world Miguel had built, discipline was everything. If one man could threaten the structure and survive, others would follow. And so, a plan was set into motion, one that would mark the beginning of the end for the Guadalajara Cartel. On 7th February 1985, the trap was sprung. It was a warm afternoon when Camarena left the U.S. consulate in Guadalajara, walking toward his car as he had done countless times before. To those watching from the shadows, the timing was perfect. A group of men approached him quickly, efficiently, and within moments he was forced into a waiting vehicle. Witnesses would later recall how fast it happened, how quiet it was, no shots, no screaming, just a sudden, chilling disappearance in broad daylight. Kiki was gone, and with him, the fragile calm that had settled over the city. What followed remains one of the most haunting chapters in the history of the drug war. Camarena was taken to a house owned by cartel associates, a place that had been prepared for what was to come. For over 30 hours, he was interrogated, tortured, and questioned about what he knew. The goal, reportedly, was not only to punish him but to extract information about what the DEA had uncovered and how much danger the cartel was truly in. The details of those hours are harrowing, and even decades later, they carry a weight that is difficult to shake. The tapes of the interrogation, later recovered by investigators, revealed the chilling professionalism of the operation. Doctors were allegedly brought in to keep Camarena alive, ensuring he could continue to answer questions. It was a methodical, calculated process, not a crime of passion but a deliberate act meant to send a message. This was what happened to those who threatened the organization. And yet, beneath the surface, there was also an air of desperation, as if the cartel, in its effort to maintain control, had crossed a line from which there could be no return. When it was over, Camarena's body, along with that of pilot Alfredo Zavala, who had also been abducted, was found wrapped in plastic, buried in a shallow grave. The discovery sent shockwaves through both Mexico and the United States. For the DEA, this was not just the loss of an agent, it was an attack on the agency itself, on the U.S. government's efforts to stem the flow of drugs. For Mexico, it was a national crisis, exposing the depth of corruption that had allowed such a crime to occur under the protection of powerful figures. News of the murder spread quickly. In Washington, outrage was immediate. Flags at DEA offices were lowered to half-staff. Kiki's colleagues, many of whom had worked side by side with him, were devastated but also galvanized. The U.S. government launched what would become Operation Leyenda, the largest homicide investigation in DEA history. Hundreds of agents were deployed, resources poured into Mexico, and pressure mounted on the Mexican government to bring those responsible to justice. Inside Guadalajara, fear took hold. The very order Miguel had tried to maintain was beginning to crack. Safe houses were abandoned, meetings moved to more remote locations, and whispers of betrayal circulated in every corner of the city. Arrests soon followed, and cartel members who had once felt untouchable found themselves hunted. The abduction and murder of Camarena had not silenced the DEA, it had awakened it. For Miguel, the decision that had seemed necessary now carried terrible consequences. The murder had brought the full weight of two governments down on his organization. The protection that had once shielded him from serious repercussions was beginning to erode. Friends in high places were suddenly distant, unwilling to be associated with a man who had provoked an international crisis. Brides that once ensured cooperation no longer worked as effectively. The storm had come, and there was no stopping it. And yet, even in the midst of this crisis, Miguel reportedly remained calm. Those who knew him said he did not shout or panic. He continued to give orders, to plan, to think 2 steps ahead. But it must have been clear, even to him, that something fundamental had shifted. The murder of Kiki Camarena had changed everything. It had transformed the Guadalajara Cartel from a discreet, largely invisible organization into the most wanted target in the Western Hemisphere. The city itself seemed to hold its breath. Streets that had once bustled with quiet confidence were now tense, watchful. Foreign journalists arrived, cameras capturing images of raids and arrests. The myth of Guadalajara as a peaceful city was shattered, and in its place was a new image, that of a place where power and corruption had collided in the most brutal way possible. The illusion of control that Miguel had maintained for so long was beginning to unravel. For those listening to this story now, perhaps lying in the dark, there is a certain stillness to this moment, a grim pause before the chaos that would follow. The abduction and murder of Kiki Camarena was more than just a crime, it was the breaking point. It marked the end of the cartel's golden era and the beginning of its downfall. The man at the center of it all, the Godfather who had built an empire on order and restraint, had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. In the days that followed, as helicopters flew over Guadalajara and agents swarmed the streets, Miguel must have felt the walls closing in. The empire he had built was no longer invisible. It was under siege, and for the first time, the man who had seemed untouchable would find himself hunted. The storm had arrived, and it would sweep away everything he had worked for. The murder of Enrique Kiki Camarena struck like an earthquake, and its aftershocks rippled through Guadalajara, through Mexico, and all the way to Washington, D.C. Almost overnight, the quiet city that had served as the nerve center of Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo's empire was transformed into a place under siege. The illusion of calm that Miguel had so carefully cultivated was gone. The United States was outraged, and the Mexican government was under enormous pressure to act. Operation Leyenda, the largest homicide investigation ever mounted by the DEA, was underway, and its sole mission was clear: find those responsible and bring them to justice. The scale of the American response was unprecedented. Teams of DEA agents flooded into Mexico, working with their Mexican counterparts, combing through intelligence and tracking every lead. The operation became a relentless hunt, and it cast a wide net. Anyone suspected of involvement, anyone connected to the Guadalajara Cartel, anyone who might know something about the abduction and murder was questioned, arrested, or pursued. Safe houses were raided, vehicles seized, and names added to growing lists of targets. For the first time, Miguel's carefully constructed shield of political protection began to show cracks. Politicians and police commanders, who had once accepted envelopes of cash and turned a blind eye, now found themselves facing international scrutiny. Suddenly, it was no longer convenient to be seen as an ally of the Godfather. Some quietly withdrew their support, distancing themselves from Miguel and his associates. Others, under pressure from Washington, began cooperating with investigators, providing names, locations, and details about the cartel's operations. The arrests came quickly. Rafael Caro Quintero, once Miguel's bold and brash partner, was captured in Costa Rica just weeks after Camarina's murder. His face splashed across newspapers as if to prove that justice was being done. His arrest sent a message to everyone still at large: the manhunt was real, and no one was beyond its reach. Soon after, Ernesto Don Neto Fonseca Carrillo was taken into custody, further destabilizing the organization. Two pillars of Miguel's leadership circle had been removed, and the weight of holding everything together now fell squarely on his shoulders. Inside the cartel, panic began to spread. Traffickers who had once operated with confidence now feared every knock at the door. Meetings became more secretive, phones were used sparingly, and trusted lieutenants started to look over their shoulders. The atmosphere of control that had characterized the Guadalajara years was replaced by one of paranoia. Everyone knew that the Americans would not rest until they had dismantled the organization piece by piece. For Miguel, the situation was a test of everything he had built. The calm, calculating leader remained outwardly composed, still speaking softly, still projecting the air of a man in control. But he must have felt the pressure mounting. Every day brought new arrests, new intelligence leaks, new betrayals. Even some of the officials who had once shielded him were now quietly cooperating with investigators, trading information to protect themselves. Despite the chaos, Miguel tried to maintain order. He called secret meetings with what remained of his leadership, urging them to stay united, to keep the routes running, to prevent open warfare from breaking out between the plaza chiefs. Money still had to move, shipments still had to cross the border, and bribes still had to be paid. The empire could not simply stop. But the more Miguel tried to hold the pieces together, the more it became clear that the structure was beginning to fracture. Operation Leyenda was methodical. Investigators tracked bank accounts, interrogated captured traffickers, and slowly unraveled the network Miguel had spent years weaving. Each arrest brought them closer to the heart of the organization. Names were passed along, safe houses discovered, caches of weapons and cash uncovered. What had once been invisible was now being mapped out in reports, diagrams, and dossiers. The empire was no longer a shadow, it was a target. Guadalajara itself changed under the weight of the investigation. Once a place where cartel members could meet freely in restaurants and hotels, it now felt dangerous, watched. Foreign journalists reported on every raid, every capture, every development in the case. The city that had once felt like a sanctuary now felt like a trap. For Miguel, this must have been a chilling realization. The walls were closing in, and there was no longer any place to hide in plain sight. Some nights, as he sat in one of his properties, perhaps staring out a window as he had so often done before, Miguel must have thought about the path that had brought him here. He had built the first true cartel, brought order to chaos, and created a system that had made everyone richer. But now, the very thing that had made him powerful, the centralization of control, was what made him so vulnerable. With him at the center, every road led back to him, and the investigators knew it. As the manhunt intensified, Miguel began to withdraw further from public view. He changed locations frequently, avoiding patterns, limiting contact even with some of his closest allies. He was no longer the calm figure hosting meetings in Guadalajara. He was now a fugitive in all but name, trying to stay one step ahead of the authorities. Still, he continued to guide operations, giving orders through intermediaries, trying to maintain the fragile alliance of plaza bosses that depended on him. But the pressure was relentless. Each week brought news of more seizures, more names added to the list of those wanted for questioning, more cartel members captured or killed. It was becoming clear that this was not a temporary storm, this was the beginning of a full-scale dismantling of everything Miguel had built. For the DEA, the operation was as much about symbolism as it was about justice. Kiki Camarina's death had become a rallying cry, and nothing short of the complete destruction of the Guadalajara Cartel would satisfy the demand for accountability. The Americans wanted not just arrests but convictions, not just disruption but the removal of the men at the very top. And Miguel, as the man known as El Padrino, was the ultimate prize. By the end of 1985, the Guadalajara Cartel was no longer the same organization it had been just a year earlier. Its leaders were scattered, its operations disrupted, its secrecy shattered. The golden age of quiet power was over. What remained was a hunted organization, led by a man who had once seemed untouchable but was now forced into the shadows. The fallout from Kiki Camarina's murder was still unfolding, and the storm was far from over. For Miguel, the next chapter would test not only his leadership but his very survival. The year after Kiki Camarina's murder was one of shadows and suspicion. The once unified Guadalajara Cartel was now a fractured network held together by fear and fading loyalty. For Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo, the man who had built this empire with precision and discipline, it must have felt as though he was watching a finely tuned machine begin to shake apart piece by piece. The very order he had worked so hard to impose was crumbling, and with it, the calm that had defined his rule. The arrests of Rafael Caro Quintero and Don Nato had left a vacuum in leadership that Miguel struggled to fill. Caro Quintero, the daring entrepreneur of Rancho Buffalo, had been a key driver of innovation, his ambition balanced by Miguel's discipline. Don Nato had been the elder statesman, a voice of reason who could calm tempers and mediate disputes. Without them, the cartel was unbalanced, like a table missing two legs. Miguel remained the central figure, but now the weight of the entire organization rested on him alone. Meetings became tense, filled with whispers and sideways glances. Plaza bosses who had once deferred to Miguel now began to question his decisions more openly. They worried that his insistence on maintaining control, his refusal to step back even as the authorities closed in, was putting them all in greater danger. Some argued that the cartel needed to decentralize further, to scatter its operations and go to ground until the storm passed. Others, emboldened by Miguel's weakened position, began quietly consolidating their own power, strengthening their personal networks in preparation for the day when they might no longer answer to Guadalajara at all. Paranoia became the air everyone breathed. Informants were suspected everywhere. Men who had been trusted for years were suddenly accused of betrayal, sometimes with little evidence. Rumors swirled of leaks to the DEA, of rivals cooperating with authorities to save themselves. Miguel, always cautious, grew more guarded. He moved constantly, avoiding patterns, limiting the number of people who knew his location at any given time. He rarely stayed in one house for long, and when he met with his lieutenants, it was often in remote ranches or safe houses, far from prying eyes. The stress began to show. Associates recalled that Miguel's once calm demeanor took on a harder edge during this period. His decisions, though still measured, were quicker, sharper, and occasionally ruthless. Those suspected of talking to authorities often disappeared, their fates sealed by the very discipline Miguel had once used to keep the peace. The goal was no longer just profit, it was survival. and survival required decisive action. The money continued to flow, but the cost of doing business had risen dramatically. Bribes had to be larger, more frequent, more carefully targeted. Corruption, once a smooth and quiet arrangement, became more complicated as officials feared being caught in the glare of Operation Leyenda. Some could no longer be bought at all, forcing Miguel to find new allies or new methods of persuasion. The delicate balance between business and politics that he had once managed so skillfully was becoming unstable. Inside the plazas, ambitions began to grow unchecked. Men like Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, Hector El Guerro Palma, and Endio Carrillo Fuentes were beginning to step out of the shadows, eager to prove themselves, eager to expand. They respected Miguel for now, but they also saw opportunity in the chaos. The idea of a single, centralized organization began to feel outdated, even dangerous. The younger generation of traffickers believed that power should be distributed, that each plaza should control its own destiny. Miguel could sense this shift, and it must have troubled him. He had built the cartel on unity, on the idea that only through coordination could they prevent the endless bloodshed that had characterized the past. Now that unity was slipping through his fingers. Some nights, Miguel may have sat in silence, replaying the decisions that had brought him here. The murder of Camarena, the raids, the arrests, each event had chipped away at the foundation of his empire. Perhaps he wondered if there had been another way, if the order he had fought to maintain had been doomed from the start. Yet regret was a luxury he could not afford. Every day required new calculations, new moves to stay one step ahead of the authorities and his increasingly restless subordinates. The tension was not limited to the cartel. The streets of Guadalajara and other key cities felt different now. Soldiers patrolled with greater frequency, checkpoints appeared on highways, and raids became almost routine. The city that had once been a sanctuary was now a place of danger, and Miguel's network had to work twice as hard to keep shipments moving. Some routes were abandoned entirely, considered too risky. Profits suffered, and with them, morale. The strain also began to show on Miguel personally. Years of careful living, of staying out of the public eye, had kept him safe, but now the constant moving, the fear of betrayal, the knowledge that he was being hunted, all of it weighed heavily. Friends and allies recalled that he became even more private, even more withdrawn, trusting only a handful of people with his thoughts. To those who saw him during these years, he seemed older, more tired, as though the burden of holding together a collapsing empire had taken its toll. And yet, despite everything, Miguel continued to lead. He still held meetings, still gave orders, still acted as the godfather to whom everyone ultimately deferred. His presence alone was enough to keep the cartel from descending into open warfare. There was still a sense that as long as Miguel was in charge, some semblance of order could be maintained. But everyone could feel the tension building. It was only a matter of time before something, or someone, would break the fragile peace. By the end of this period, the cracks in the empire were no longer hairline fractures. They were widening fissures, threatening to split the organization apart. The plaza bosses were gaining strength, the authorities were closing in, and Miguel's grip was slipping. The man who had once been the architect of Mexico's underworld was now its caretaker, desperately trying to keep a system alive that was slowly, inexorably, breaking down. The next step would be one of the most consequential decisions of his life, a decision that would reshape the cartel world forever. Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo had always believed that the strength of the Guadalajara Cartel lay in its unity. It was his great innovation to bring the scattered, warring smugglers of Mexico under one umbrella to create a network that functioned like a business rather than a battleground. But by the late 1980s, that unity was becoming impossible to maintain. The pressure from Operation Leyenda had weakened the Central Command. Caro Quintero and Don Nato were behind bars, plaza bosses were acting with increasing independence, and Miguel himself was forced to remain in hiding, always on the move. The empire was too large for one man to control directly, especially while being hunted. And so, reluctantly, Miguel made the decision that would define the next era of Mexico's underworld. He would break the empire apart not to destroy it, but to keep it alive. The decision was not made lightly. In secret meetings, Miguel gathered the most trusted lieutenants, the men who controlled the major smuggling corridors, and laid out his plan. Each of them would receive control of a plaza, a territory through which drugs would move, and each would be responsible for maintaining order, paying off authorities, and ensuring that shipments kept flowing. In return, they would pay a fee back to the central organization, a tribute to maintain the network as a whole. It was, in effect, a decentralization of power, a move that transformed the cartel from a single entity into a federation. Imagine those meetings. The men sitting around the table, future kings in their own right, listening as Miguel, calm and deliberate, explained that this was the only way forward. Some may have felt relief at the new autonomy, others may have quietly seen it as a chance to expand their own ambitions. Men like Joaquin El Chapo Guzman and Hector El Guerro Palma, who had long worked under the shadow of older bosses, now had the opportunity to control their own regions. Endio Carrillo Fuentes, who would later be known as the Lord of the Skies for his fleet of drug-running airplanes, also received his own territory. Even the Arellano Felix brothers, Miguel's nephews, were given control of Tijuana, a lucrative border crossing that would soon become infamous. For Miguel, this was not a surrender but a calculated strategy. The empire had grown too large and too vulnerable. By dividing it, he hoped to make it harder to dismantle. If one plaza fell, the others could continue operating. The Americans could no longer target a single organization. They would now have to fight multiple, semi-independent groups. It was, in its own way, a brilliant move, one that would keep the flow of drugs steady even as the storm of Operation Leyenda continued to rage. And for a time, it worked. The new plaza bosses accepted. The arrangement and order, at least temporarily, was restored. Routes were secured, bribes were paid, and shipments moved north once again. The Guadalajara Cartel, as it had existed, was gone, but in its place was something more diffuse, harder to strike at, harder to control. Miguel had ensured the survival of the network, even as his personal control over it diminished. Yet in that very act of preservation, Miguel also planted the seeds of the bloody wars that would define the decades to come. Each plaza boss was now a sovereign power within his own territory, and with sovereignty came ambition. The arrangement depended on cooperation, on the idea that each boss would respect the boundaries of the others and continue to pay tribute to the system Miguel had created. But the more power these men gained, the less inclined they were to share it. Rivalries that had once been held in check by Miguel's authority began to simmer beneath the surface. Even as the federation took shape, Miguel remained in the background, acting as the mediator of disputes and the keeper of the peace. When two plazas came into conflict, He would step in to negotiate a solution, reminding them that war was bad for business. But every time he had to intervene, it became clearer that his voice carried a little less weight than before. These were no longer subordinates, they were bosses in their own right, men who commanded armies of their own, men who could defy Guadalajara if they chose. The decision to divide the cartel also forced Miguel to rely on secrecy more than ever. By 1989, the manhunt for him had become intense, and he rarely stayed in one place for long. He moved between safe houses, meeting with plaza bosses only when absolutely necessary, often sending messages through trusted intermediaries. The godfather of Mexico's drug empire had become a ghost, orchestrating what remained of the network from the shadows, even as the network slowly slipped beyond his reach. For those who worked closely with him, these final years of Miguel's freedom must have felt tense and surreal. The man who had once presided over elegant dinners in Guadalajara now lived in a state of constant vigilance, his movements restricted, his circle of trust smaller than ever. And yet, he still believed that the system he had created, the Federation of Plazas, could endure, that it could prevent the chaos he had feared since the early days of his career. He had built a system designed to keep the peace. Whether it would hold after he was gone was a question even he could not answer. In the short term, the decision to create the Federation was a success. The drug trade did not stop. In fact, it flourished. The Colombians continued to ship cocaine through Mexico, and the profits continued to grow. Each plaza boss invested in his own routes, his own protection networks, his own fleet of vehicles or planes. The system became more efficient, more specialized, more resilient to outside pressure. To the Americans, it was as if the cartel had not been dismantled but had multiplied, turning one target into many. But beneath this surface of functionality, the quiet order of the Guadalajara years was gone forever. The plaza bosses were not content to simply maintain what they had been given. They watched one another with suspicion, eyed one another's routes, and began to prepare for the day when disputes would no longer be solved at a table but with bullets. Miguel had created a network that could survive without him, but in doing so, he had created the conditions for a new era of bloodshed. For now, though, there was a fragile peace. Miguel, though increasingly isolated, was still alive, still guiding the system he had created, still believed to be the man who could impose order on the chaos of the underworld. The Federation was young, its future uncertain, but its architect was still present, still casting a long shadow over Mexico's drug trade. It would not be long, however, before that shadow disappeared, and the plazas would be left to their own devices. And when that day came, the consequences would shake Mexico for decades. For years, one of Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo's greatest strengths had been his ability to move between two worlds, the shadowed corridors of the underworld and the polished halls of political power. Unlike the brash traffickers who flaunted their wealth, Miguel cultivated relationships. Quietly, carefully, and at the highest levels. His network of political protection was not just an asset, it was the shield that had allowed the Guadalajara Cartel to flourish with so little interference. Governors, police commanders, judges, even federal officials had, at one time or another, benefited from his generosity. To them, Miguel was not merely a criminal. He was a man who kept the peace, a man who provided order in a country where chaos was never far away. The system worked through discretion. When a shipment was scheduled to move through a particular state, Miguel or one of his trusted men would ensure that the right envelopes reached the right hands. Roadblocks would disappear, patrol schedules would be adjusted, and the trucks would pass through unimpeded. When a rival threatened to disrupt business, a quiet call to a well-placed friend could result in an arrest or at least a reminder to stand down. It was a mutually beneficial arrangement. The politicians received money that could fund campaigns or line pockets, and Miguel received the one thing he valued most: stability. Some of these relationships went beyond mere transactions. There were politicians who truly saw Miguel as a valuable figure, someone who had brought a measure of control to the drug trade. Violence in Guadalajara had been relatively low under his leadership, and that peace had political value. As long as Miguel kept the money flowing and the killings minimal, many in power were content to look the other way. In a country where corruption was woven into the fabric of daily life, this arrangement seemed almost natural. But the murder of Enrique "Kiki" Camarena changed everything. The outrage from Washington was so intense, the diplomatic pressure so great, that the Mexican government could no longer afford to protect the man at the center of it all. Politicians who had once been Miguel's allies now found themselves under scrutiny. Journalists began asking uncomfortable questions about who had allowed the cartel to operate so openly for so long. U.S. officials demanded results, and suddenly, the very men who had shielded Miguel were being called upon to deliver him. It must have been a strange and bitter feeling for Miguel, watching the network he had spent years cultivating begin to crumble. The same officials who had once dined with him, who had accepted his gifts and enjoyed his hospitality, now began to distance themselves. Some stopped taking his calls. Others quietly warned him that the pressure from above was too great, that they could no longer protect him without risking their own careers or their own freedom. Miguel was too intelligent not to see the writing on the wall. The political winds had shifted, and he was now a liability. Yet even as his circle of protection shrank, Miguel continued to play the game as best he could. He reached out to those who remained loyal, calling in favors, securing safe passage where possible. His ability to move from safe house to safe house, to remain just beyond the reach of his pursuers, owed much to the remnants of this network. But every day, it became harder to maintain. Each new arrest brought investigators closer. Each new defection weakened his position. There must have been nights when Miguel sat in a quiet room, considering the irony of his situation. He had built the first great cartel by understanding that money could buy loyalty, that order could be maintained through careful negotiation and corruption. Now, with the entire weight of the U.S. and Mexican governments against him, he was discovering the limits of that philosophy. Money could buy silence, but it could not buy absolution. And no amount of bribery could undo what had been done to Camarena. In many ways, this period marked the last flicker of Miguel's influence in the political sphere. He was still feared, still respected, but no longer untouchable. The shield that had once been impenetrable was full of holes. Allies were being investigated, arrested, or quietly removed from their positions. The governor who had once counted on Miguel's loyalty was gone, replaced by men who had no interest in carrying the weight of his protection. The game had changed, and Miguel was running out of moves. Still, he did not panic. Those who knew him said that he remained calm, dignified, even in these final months of freedom. He continued to conduct business as quietly as possible, still believing that he could hold things together, at least long enough to secure the future of the federation he had created. But deep down, he must have known that the days of protection were over. The political machine that had once worked in his favor was now turning against him, slowly but inexorably. The quiet dinners, the discreet meetings, the envelopes passed under tables, all of it was coming to an end. Soon, there would be no safe house far enough away, no official willing to risk everything for him. The man who had once been shielded by the highest levels of power was about to face the one thing he had managed to avoid for years: capture. The political storm was closing in, and even Miguel's legendary composure could not hold it off forever. The last days of Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo's freedom were marked by an almost airy calm. For a man who had spent years building and commanding Mexico's most powerful drug organization, there was no dramatic collapse, no sudden descent into chaos, only a slow tightening of the net, a gradual closing of the circle until there were no safe places left to go. By early 1989, the man once called El Padrino was living like a ghost, moving from house to house, always careful, always watchful, always aware that each sunrise might be the last he would see as a free man. Guadalajara, once the comfortable headquarters of his empire, had become a place of unease. The restaurants where he had once met partners were now watched. The hotels where business had been conducted were now crawling with informants. The city's streets, once symbols of prosperity and discretion, now felt hostile, lined with soldiers and police conducting sweeps in search of cartel members. Miguel knew that every movement was being tracked, every visit reported by someone. He trusted very few people, perhaps only a handful, and even then, trust was given cautiously. He had relocated much of his life to quieter places, favoring secluded ranches and safe houses where he could remain hidden for weeks at a time. These homes were often well-appointed but sparse, chosen for security rather than luxury. In the evenings, when the work of the day was done, he would sit in silence, listening to the hum of the countryside, reflecting on the path that had brought him here. He was not a man given to outbursts or displays of emotion, but those who were close to him during this time said he seemed more introspective, almost resigned, as though he understood that his time was running out. Despite the constant threat of arrest, Miguel continued to work. He still held discreet meetings with plaza bosses, traveling under heavy guard to discuss routes, payments, and the coordination of shipments. These meetings, once held with a sense of control and authority, now carried a different tone, quieter, more urgent, as though everyone present knew that the future was uncertain. The plaza bosses listened respectfully, but some were already thinking beyond Miguel, preparing for the day when he would no longer be there to hold the federation together. Miguel must have sensed this shift. He had created the plaza system to ensure the survival of the network, but he also knew that the men who controlled those territories were ambitious, that they might not remain loyal once the central authority was gone. It was, in many ways, the final irony of his career. The very system that had been designed to protect the cartel was also the system that would allow it to continue without him. Whether that thought brought him comfort or sorrow, no one can say. In those last weeks, the pressure from the authorities was relentless. The DEA and Mexican Federal Police had intensified their hunt, using every lead, every tip, every shred of intelligence to track his movements. Arrests of lower-level operatives continued, and with each capture came new information that narrowed the search. Miguel responded by becoming even more elusive, sometimes staying only a night or two in one location before moving again. The effort to remain ahead of the authorities was exhausting, even for a man as disciplined as he was. It is said that in those days, Miguel remained calm, never panicked, never allowed fear to cloud his judgment. He continued to speak softly, to weigh his words carefully, to project the same quiet authority that had made him so respected. But he must have felt the weight of inevitability pressing down. There are moments in life when one knows the end is near, when every sound in the night, every knock at the door, carries the possibility that it is finally over. For Miguel, those moments must have come daily. He still made time for family, visiting them when he could, maintaining the image of a man who was not on the run but merely careful. Those visits were likely bittersweet, filled with unspoken understanding that the time they had together was limited. Perhaps he tried to reassure them, perhaps he spoke of the future, of what would happen to his businesses, his properties, his legacy. More than anything, Miguel seemed determined to leave the Federation intact, to ensure that what he had built would outlast him. The Mexican press, by this point, had begun to write about him more openly. His name appeared in headlines, his photograph occasionally printed alongside reports about the manhunt. To the public, he was becoming less of a mystery and more of a symbol, the man at the center of the storm, the architect of an empire that the government now claimed it was dismantling. The legend of El Padrino was growing even as the man himself was slipping further into the shadows. By April of 1989, the authorities had narrowed his location to Guadalajara. The circle was nearly closed. Soldiers and federal agents were deployed, safe houses were raided, and one by one, Miguel's options were disappearing. Those last nights must have been tense, but strangely quiet. There were no grand shootouts, no last stands. Miguel was not a man who believed in wasting life recklessly. He had always seen himself as a businessman, not a bandit, and he had no interest in going out in a blaze of gunfire. The dawn of 8th April 1989 arrived like any other day, but it would be the last day of Miguel's freedom. As the sun rose over Guadalajara, the quiet streets gave no sign that history was about to turn. Inside the house where he was staying, Miguel prepared for the day as calmly as ever. He did not run. He did not try to flee the city. Perhaps he had known all along that this moment would come, that no empire lasts forever, that every ruler eventually faces his reckoning. Those who were there later recalled that when the authorities finally arrived, Miguel did not resist. There were no shots fired, no desperate escape attempts. He surrendered quietly, with the same dignity he had carried throughout his career. The godfather of Mexico's drug trade, the man who had built the first true cartel, was led away in handcuffs. The calm he had carried into every decision remained with him to the end of his free life. It was, in its own way, a fitting end to this chapter of his story, not with chaos, but with silence. The man who had imposed order on a world of chaos stepped out of his last sanctuary with the same quiet control he had always shown, walking into the custody of the state as though it were simply another part of the plan. What awaited him next would be a different kind of life entirely, one measured not in routes and profits, but in walls and bars and long, quiet years. The morning of 8th April 1989 unfolded with deceptive normalcy. The sun rose over Guadalajara, casting warm light across the city streets. In the quiet residential neighborhood where Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo was hiding, birds chirped and vendors set up their stalls for the day. There was nothing to suggest that history was about to shift, that the most powerful drug lord in Mexico was about to be captured. Inside the house, Miguel began his day as he always did, calm, measured, composed. If he sensed that the authorities were closing in, he gave no sign. When the operation began, it was swift and methodical. A joint team of Mexican Federal Police and military personnel surrounded the property, moving into position with the precision of a carefully rehearsed raid. Neighbors later recalled the sudden appearance of uniformed men, the quiet tension that filled the air. The house was cordoned off, escape routes cut off, and then the command was given. Agents moved in. Inside, there was no firefight, no dramatic last stand. Miguel was taken by surprise, but he did not resist. He was unarmed, and when the authorities entered, he reportedly greeted them with the same calm dignity that had marked his rule. There was no shouting, no frantic pleas, just a quiet acceptance, as though he had been expecting this moment all along. The man who had once commanded an empire simply nodded, allowing the agents to place him in handcuffs. The scene, though subdued, carried a heavy sense of finality. This was not just another arrest, it was the fall of a figure who had loomed over Mexico's underworld for more than a decade. As Miguel was led out of the house and placed into a waiting vehicle, the moment felt almost ceremonial, like the closing of a chapter. He was still impeccably dressed, still carried himself with composure, even as cameras flashed and onlookers whispered. It was the last image of El Padrino as a free man, calm, expressionless, walking into custody without a struggle. News of the arrest spread quickly. Within hours, radio stations and newspapers across Mexico were reporting that the godfather of the Guadalajara Cartel had been captured. Headlines declared the event as a major victory in the war on drugs, and officials were quick to present it as proof that the government was serious about dismantling organized crime. In Washington, the news was greeted with satisfaction. For the DEA, this was the culmination of years of work, the long-awaited justice for the murder of Enrique "Kiki" Camarena. But the arrest was more than just a legal milestone, it was a symbolic one. Miguel had represented a certain vision of the drug trade, one built on structure, discipline, and a preference for order over chaos. His capture signaled the end of that era. Without him at the center, the carefully balanced federation he had created was at risk of splintering. The plaza bosses, now largely autonomous, would soon be free to pursue their own ambitions without the restraining influence of El Padrino. Inside the organization, the arrest sent shockwaves. Some lieutenants saw it as a tragedy, the inevitable consequence of years of mounting pressure. Others saw it as an opportunity, a chance to step out from under Miguel's shadow and seize greater power. For the younger generation, men like Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, Hector Palma, and Endio Carrillo Fuentes, this was the moment when the future opened before them. They would carry the trade forward, but in ways far different from the quiet, centralized control Miguel had favored. The Mexican public, too, reacted with mixed feelings. Some viewed the arrest as a victory, a sign that justice was finally being done. Others, especially those in regions where the cartel had provided jobs and stability, saw it as the end of a certain kind of peace. Under Miguel's leadership, violence had been kept relatively low. There was fear that without him, the delicate balance he had maintained would collapse, leading to bloodshed as rival factions fought for control. History would later prove those fears well-founded. Miguel himself was transported under heavy guard, moved through secure facilities as authorities took no chances with such a high-profile prisoner. Reports from those who saw him during this time described him as quiet, almost contemplative. He did not rage against his captors or plead for mercy. He answered questions politely, gave statements with calm precision, and carried himself not as a defeated man, but as one who had accepted his fate. In a way, his composure was unsettling, a reminder that this was not an ordinary criminal, but a man who had lived by a personal code, even in the shadows. Court proceedings would follow, and eventually, Miguel would be convicted for his role in Camarina's murder and sentenced to decades in prison. But in those first days after his capture, the focus was not on trials or legal arguments, it was on the fact that the Godfather had fallen. Television programs replayed the footage of his arrest, commentators speculated on what it meant for the future of the drug trade, and ordinary citizens debated whether the capture would bring an end to the flow of narcotics northward. Few realized that this moment, rather than stopping the trade, would mark the beginning of a far bloodier chapter. For Miguel, the arrest was the closing of one life and the beginning of another. No longer could he move through Guadalajara with quiet authority, no longer could he summon plaza bosses to secret meetings, no longer could he control the empire he had built. His world was now reduced to the walls of a cell, his freedom measured in hours of sunlight and the rare visits from family or lawyers. And yet, even in this fall, there was a certain dignity. He had not gone down in flames, had not chosen the path of violent resistance. He had surrendered as quietly as he had lived, leaving behind an empire that would continue to cast its shadow long after he was gone. The arrest of Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo was more than the capture of a single man, it was the end of an era, the final act in the story of the Guadalajara Cartel as a unified force. The man who had once been called El Padrino was no longer free, but the system he had created would live on, reshaped by those who inherited it. The calm order he had imposed was gone, and the future would belong to a new generation, one less concerned with balance and far more willing to wage open war. Prison did not break Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo. When the heavy gates closed behind him and the world of freedom was shut away, he did not rage or curse his fate. True to his nature, he remained calm, dignified, and deliberate. For a man who had spent years living with the constant threat of arrest, perhaps the reality of confinement came not as a shock but as a quiet inevitability. In many ways, prison was simply the next chapter of his life, a different kind of control, one where the boundaries were smaller, but the mind was still free to calculate, to plan, to observe. At first, Miguel's influence extended far beyond the walls that contained him. He still had loyal associates on the outside, plaza bosses who respected him, operatives who took his calls and followed his instructions. Even from behind bars, he was able to guide certain decisions, mediate disputes, and keep some semblance of the old order alive. Messages were passed discreetly through lawyers, family members, or trusted intermediaries. For a time, it seemed as though Miguel's voice still echoed through the corridors of Mexico's underworld, even if it could no longer command it outright. But prison life was its own kind of trial. The days were long and quiet, the routines monotonous. Miguel had been a man accustomed to movement, to late-night strategy sessions, to the steady rhythm of a world that revolved around his decisions. Now, he was just another inmate, subject to the schedules of guards and the slow turning of prison clocks. He spent his time reading, writing, and reflecting, his once busy life reduced to the narrow confines of his cell. And yet, those who visited him during these years said that he remained composed, still carrying himself with the quiet dignity that had earned him the name El Padrino. Outside the prison walls, the world he had built was changing rapidly. The plaza system he had designed survived his absence, But without his careful hand at the center, it began to evolve into something far more chaotic. Ambitious plaza bosses grew more independent, and rivalries that Miguel might once have resolved through negotiation now turned violent. The peace of the Guadalajara years was gone, replaced by a new era of open conflict. Shootouts erupted in border towns, assassinations claimed the lives of police chiefs, judges, and journalists, and the death toll began to climb into the thousands. Miguel, watching from a distance, must have felt the irony. He had built the cartel system to bring order to the trade, to prevent exactly this kind of bloodshed. Now, as he read reports or heard news from visitors, he saw that order dissolving into war. The men who had once sat at his table, Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, Mdo Carrillo Fuentes, the Arellano Felix brothers, were no longer junior partners but kings in their own right, each commanding armies, each waging battles for control of routes and territories. The Federation had become a battlefield. Still, there were moments when Miguel's opinion carried weight. Disputes that threatened to spiral out of control were occasionally referred to him, and his word still held power among those who remembered the old ways. In those moments, Miguel became less a leader and more a kind of elder statesman, a figure whose advice was sought not because he could enforce it, but because his wisdom was still respected. He would offer counsel, urging caution, urging peace, reminding the new generation that too much violence would only bring more attention from the government. Sometimes they listened. More often, they did not. The years passed, and Miguel's influence faded further. Younger leaders rose to power, men who had grown up in a different world, a world where the drug trade was no longer quiet, where the headlines were filled with stories of massacres and narco banners left at crime scenes. These men were not interested in the subtle diplomacy that Miguel had practiced. They ruled through fear and spectacle, through public displays of brutality meant to intimidate rivals and authorities alike. The era of the businessman Godfather had ended, the era of the warlord had begun. Inside his cell, Miguel grew older, his hair grayer, his health more fragile. The long years took their toll, as they do on any man. By the time the 2000s arrived, he was no longer the sharp, commanding figure who had once stood at the center of Mexico's underworld. He was now a prisoner in every sense, largely forgotten by the public except as a name in history books and occasional documentaries. His empire, though still thriving in some form, had long since passed into the hands of others. And yet, even in this quiet decline, there was a certain peace. Miguel was not a man given to nostalgia, but there must have been nights when he lay awake, thinking of Bella Vista, of the dusty roads of his childhood, of the first days when he had worn a police uniform, of the meetings where the Guadalajara Cartel was first imagined. Perhaps he thought of the mistakes, too, the decisions that had led to the murder of Kiki Camarena, the event that had triggered the downfall of everything he had built. Whether he regretted them or simply accepted them as the cost of his choices, no one can say. In prison, Miguel became almost a ghostly figure, a quiet presence whose story had been overtaken by the noise of a new generation. But for those who remembered the early days, for those who had seen the way he had once brought order to chaos, there was still a certain respect. He was, after all, the man who had shown that Mexico's traffickers could be organized, that the trade could be centralized and disciplined. Even in his fall, his legacy remained. The Godfather was no longer free, but his shadow stretched far beyond the prison walls. The system he had built was still the foundation upon which the modern cartels stood, even if they had turned it into something he would scarcely recognize. For Miguel, life behind bars became a kind of quiet observation post, a place from which he could watch the world he had shaped spin out of his control. It was a life of reflection, of waiting, of watching as the torch passed to men far more violent than he had ever been. And so he remained a prisoner, but still a figure of myth, still a name that carried weight, still the godfather of Mexico's underworld, even as the underworld moved on without him. When Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo was taken away in handcuffs, the Guadalajara Cartel did not collapse overnight. The routes still existed, the crops were still being harvested, and the plaza bosses still controlled their territories. But without the Godfather's steady hand at the center, the fragile balance he had maintained began to wobble. What followed was not an immediate explosion, but a slow, rising storm, a transformation that would change Mexico's criminal landscape forever. At first, the plaza system seemed to work as intended. Each boss continued to operate semi-independently, paying tribute to the Federation as they had before. Shipments moved, money flowed, and there was a sense, however brief, that the machine might keep running even without its architect. But the absence of a unifying figure soon became impossible to ignore. Disputes that Miguel would have mediated began to fester. Minor skirmishes escalated into feuds. Old rivalries, long kept in check by the threat of El Padrino's discipline, began to resurface. The most dangerous tensions arose between the new powers in the northwest, the Arellano Felix brothers, who controlled the Tijuana corridor, and the faction led by Joaquin El Chapo Guzman and Hector El Guerro Palma, who were building what would become the Sinaloa Cartel. Both groups had inherited lucrative routes, and both wanted to expand. The Tijuana corridor, with its proximity to California, was one of the most valuable pieces of territory in the entire drug trade. Guzman and Palma coveted access, while the Arellanos guarded it fiercely. It was only a matter of time before words gave way to bullets. When the first clashes came, they were targeted and surgical, assassinations carried out with precision, bodies left as messages. But as the 1990s progressed, the violence escalated into open warfare. Shootouts erupted in border towns, ambushes took place on highways, and entire neighborhoods became battlegrounds. Civilians were caught in the crossfire, and for the first time, Mexico's cities felt the full weight of cartel war. The quiet, businesslike era of the Guadalajara Cartel was over, the age of spectacle had begun. The Juárez Cartel, under the leadership of Endio Carrillo Fuentes, also rose during this time. Known as El Señor de los Cielos, or the Lord of the Skies, Endio revolutionized smuggling by using a fleet of airplanes to move cocaine from Colombia through Mexico. His organization became immensely powerful, rivaling both Tijuana and Sinaloa. For a time, Endio managed to keep the peace with his rivals, preferring to make deals rather than wage war. But as the stakes grew higher, even Juárez could not escape the gravity of conflict. From his prison cell, Miguel could only watch as the system he had created was transformed into something he had never intended. He had always believed that violence was bad for business, that peace was more profitable than war. But the new generation saw things differently. To them, violence was not just a tool, it was a message, a way to intimidate rivals, control territory, and demonstrate power. The more spectacular the act, the more it resonated. Where Miguel had operated in the shadows, the new cartels sought to dominate headlines. The death toll mounted. Journalists who dared to report on cartel activities were threatened or killed. Police commanders who refused to cooperate were gunned down. Politicians were assassinated in broad daylight, their deaths serving as warnings to others who might stand in the way. The Mexican government, overwhelmed and often compromised by corruption, struggled to respond. In many regions, it was the cartels, not the state, that held the real power. For ordinary citizens, life became increasingly dangerous. Extortion, kidnappings, and public displays of brutality became common. The sense of uneasy peace that had characterized Miguel's era was gone, replaced by a pervasive fear that could be felt in every border town and major city. Mothers kept their children inside after dark. Businesses paid protection money just to survive. The streets, once simply conduits for commerce, became lines on a map where blood was spilled to claim control. In many ways, Miguel's arrest had created a paradox. By removing the centralized figure who had held the cartel together, authorities had hoped to dismantle the drug trade. Instead, they had fragmented it, creating multiple power centers that competed violently for dominance. Each victory against one cartel simply created space for another to grow. The problem was no longer one organization but many, each more aggressive and less predictable than the last. Even the Colombians, who had once dealt exclusively with Miguel and his trusted lieutenants, now found themselves navigating a more complex landscape. Shipments were divided among multiple cartels, alliances were constantly shifting, and the risk of betrayal increased. The flow of cocaine did not slow, in fact, it often increased, but the cost, in lives and stability, grew higher with each passing year. For Miguel, hearing of these wars from behind bars must have been a bitter experience. He had tried to prevent this very outcome, believing that a centralized system could keep the trade disciplined and avoid needless bloodshed. Now, as he aged in prison, he saw the country consumed by the very chaos he had spent his career trying to control. The Godfather's dream of order had given way to a nightmare of endless conflict. And yet, even in the darkness of this new era, Miguel's influence could still be felt. The plaza system he had created remained the backbone of the drug trade. Even the most violent cartels continued to operate within the territorial framework he had established, collecting taxes from those who moved product through their zones, enforcing discipline on those who broke the rules. In this way, Miguel's legacy endured, even as his vision for a more orderly underworld lay in ruins. By the late 1990s, the cartel wars had become a permanent feature of Mexico's landscape. The killings no longer shocked, they were expected. For the Mexican government and the public, the question was no longer how to end the drug trade but how to survive it. For the men who had once been Miguel's protégés, the war was an opportunity, a chance to seize more routes, more territory, more power. The cycle of violence, once begun, showed no signs of stopping. And so, from the quiet of his prison cell, Miguel bore witness to the unintended consequences of his own genius. He had built the system that made it all possible, but he could not control what came after him. The seeds of chaos had been planted, and they had taken root. What grew from them would define Mexico's underworld for generations to come, a dark legacy that even the Godfather himself could not have imagined. Time is the one enemy no empire can defeat. For Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo, the passing years behind bars were as relentless as the slow erosion of stone. In the beginning, he had entered prison with composure, even a kind of quiet authority, still very much the man who had once commanded Mexico's underworld. But as the years turned to decades, the world outside continued to spin, and the man who had once been called El Padrino became less a figure of fear and more a figure of memory. The prison that held him became his entire world, a world measured not by power plays and shipments, but by the routines of guards, the shuffling of other inmates, and the slow tolling of days that all seemed to blend together. Miguel had always been a disciplined man, and in those early years, he maintained a routine. He read, wrote, exercised, and kept his mind sharp. But as time wore on, the isolation deepened, and the body, once strong and commanding, began to fail him. Illness came quietly at first, aches that lingered, fatigue that could no longer be brushed off, and then with more force. Age had not spared him. Reports from those who saw him during these later years spoke of a man who had grown frail, his once dark hair now silver, his eyesight dimming, his movements slower. By the 2000s, he was partially blind and suffered from serious health problems. The man who had once sat at the head of a table full of plaza bosses, directing an empire with a glance, now spent much of his time in a wheelchair, his world reduced to the narrow corridors of a prison. Yet even in this decline, there was still a quiet dignity about him. He did not complain publicly, did not lash out, did not seek pity. Instead, he endured, as though accepting that this was the natural end of the path he had chosen. When he did speak, in rare interviews or conversations with visitors, his voice was soft, deliberate, carrying the weight of someone who had seen too much and lived long enough to reflect on it. He would sometimes speak of the past, of the order he had tried to create, of the mistakes that had led to his downfall. Whether these were words of regret or simply observation was left for others to interpret. Outside the prison walls, the world had changed beyond recognition. The cartel wars he had tried to prevent had exploded into a nationwide crisis. Entire regions were engulfed in violence, and new cartels had risen, some bearing names that had not even existed when Miguel was arrested. The Sinaloa Cartel, once just a faction under the Guadalajara umbrella, had become a global powerhouse, its leaders as infamous as any in history. The Juárez Cartel, the Gulf Cartel, the Zetas, all of them owed something to the system Miguel had created, and yet all of them had taken it in directions he never intended. In many ways, Miguel became a forgotten man. Younger generations, growing up in an era of headline-grabbing violence and narco corridos that glorified modern cartel leaders, barely knew his name. To them, Miguel was history, a figure from a quieter time, when the drug trade was still something whispered about rather than splashed across every front page. And yet, for those who remembered, he was still a legend, the man who had built the first true cartel, the one who had shown that the trade could be organized like a business. Miguel himself seemed to retreat into reflection. As his health declined, he spoke more about the past than the present, more about the lessons of life than about the business that had once consumed him. He expressed, in some rare moments, a wish that the violence that had engulfed Mexico would come to an end. There was a sadness in those words, as though he understood that the order he had imposed had given way to chaos, that the structure he had built had not survived him but had mutated into something far more destructive. By the late 2010s, Miguel was a shadow of the man he had once been. He was transferred to house arrest in 2019 due to his failing health, a mercy granted to an old man who could no longer pose a threat. Even then, he lived quietly, away from the public eye, rarely seen or heard from. For many, it was strange to think of the once feared Godfather living out his days in quiet isolation, far removed from the power and wealth he had once commanded. In this final phase of his life, Miguel became something almost symbolic, a living reminder of a time when the drug trade had been different, when it had been ruled not by open war but by a single, calculating mind that valued control above spectacle. His life was no longer about power or profit, but about enduring the slow passage of time, watching as history moved on and the world he had built slipped further into the past. There is a kind of melancholy in this ending, but also a sense of inevitability. Every empire fades. Every king eventually becomes a relic. Miguel's decline was quiet, almost serene, the opposite of the noisy, violent era that followed him. In the end, the Godfather did not die in a hail of bullets or in a bloody betrayal, but in the slow, inevitable fading of age. For a man who had always valued order, perhaps this was fitting, not chaos, not drama, just the gentle closing of a long, tumultuous chapter. Legacy is a complicated thing, especially for a man like Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo. By the time he reached his later years, he had become more than just a historical figure, he had become a symbol, a name spoken in narco corridors, a ghostly presence haunting Mexico's criminal landscape. For some, he was the visionary who brought order to chaos, who turned a collection of scattered smugglers into a disciplined network. For others, he was the man who opened the gates to a nightmare, the architect whose system unleashed the violent generations that followed. The truth, as it so often is, lies somewhere in between. What cannot be denied is that Miguel was the first to truly professionalize the drug trade in Mexico. Before him, smuggling was largely a family affair, small groups moving product in limited quantities, constantly clashing with one another, always vulnerable to law enforcement raids. Miguel saw the inefficiency in this and imagined something larger, something organized, something that could function like a multinational corporation. He centralized operations, created a system of routes, and introduced the plaza structure, an innovation that would outlast him by decades. Even today, long after his arrest, the plaza system remains the backbone of cartel operations across Mexico. This is perhaps Miguel's most enduring legacy, the idea that the drug trade could be structured, managed, and controlled. It was a vision that reduced unnecessary violence, at least for a time, and maximized profit. Under his watch, the Guadalajara years were comparatively stable. Violence was used sparingly and strategically, corruption was systematic rather than chaotic, and there was a sense, however dark, that someone was at the helm steering the ship. For those who lived through that time, it was a period when the drug trade felt almost invisible, something happening quietly in the background rather than erupting in the streets. But there is a darker side to this legacy. By professionalizing the trade, Miguel also expanded it to unprecedented levels. The partnership with the Colombians, which he helped forge, opened a floodgate of cocaine into the United States. The profits were staggering, but so too were the consequences. Addiction rates soared, enforcement intensified, and the stakes of the drug war grew higher with each passing year. Miguel had built a system that was efficient, but it was also relentless, feeding a demand that showed no signs of slowing. In this way, his genius was both a triumph and a tragedy. There is also the question of myth. In the years since his arrest, Miguel's name has taken on an almost legendary quality. Popular culture has turned him into a character, the calm, calculating Godfather who preferred diplomacy to bloodshed. This image, while rooted in truth, sometimes overshadows the harsher realities of his reign. The murder of Enrique "Kiki" Camarena remains one of the darkest moments in the history of the DEA, a crime that brought two nations to the brink and set in motion a chain of events that would lead to thousands of deaths in the years that followed. Miguel may not have personally carried out the act, but as the head of the cartel, the responsibility ultimately rested with him. And yet, for many in Mexico, particularly in the regions where he operated, Miguel is remembered not with fear, but with a strange kind of respect. He was known as a man who kept his word, who invested in local communities, who preferred to solve disputes quietly rather than through violence. In some towns, he is spoken of almost nostalgically, as if his era represented a time when things were more predictable, when the drug trade was less destructive to everyday life. Compared to the brutal cartel wars that followed, the Guadalajara years seem to some like a kind of dark golden age. This duality, the myth and the reality, is what makes Miguel's legacy so enduring. He was both a criminal mastermind and a man who sought order. He was both the architect of a system that reduced violence and the one whose system paved the way for the bloodshed of the 1990s and 2000s. He was, in many ways, a reflection of Mexico itself during that era, complex, contradictory, capable of both great pragmatism and great tragedy. Today, when historians and journalists speak of the drug war, Miguel's name inevitably appears near the beginning. He is seen as the father of the modern Mexican drug trade, the man who laid the foundation for everything that came after. The cartels that dominate headlines today, Sinaloa, Jalisco New Generation, Gulf, Juárez, all operate on a framework that Miguel pioneered. His influence, though indirect, still shapes the strategies and structures of the underworld. There is also something haunting about his personal journey. He did not die violently, as so many of his successors would. He did not go out in a blaze of gunfire or a dramatic betrayal. Instead, he faded slowly, quietly, watching as the empire he had built transformed into something far more violent than he had ever intended. Perhaps this is what gives his story its strange, almost tragic quality. It is not simply the story of a rise and a fall, but of a man who tried to control chaos, and in doing so, unleashed a future even he could not predict. For listeners hearing this story now, lying in the quiet of their own rooms, there is a lesson in Miguel's life that goes beyond the world of cartels and crime. It is a reminder that power, no matter how carefully built, is temporary. That control, no matter how absolute it seems, eventually slips away. And that every decision, every alliance, every betrayal, every act of violence echoes far beyond the moment it is made. Miguel's choices shaped decades of history. They still shape lives today. In the end, Miguel's legacy is neither entirely dark nor entirely light. It is a complex tapestry, woven with ambition, discipline, tragedy, and unintended consequences. He was a man who built a system, and that system outlived him. Whether that is a mark of success or failure is a question that only time can answer. But one thing is certain, the story of Mexico's cartels cannot be told without him. His name, his system, his quiet, calculating presence, they remain, like a whisper that drifts through history, reminding us of the man who once tried to bring order to the underworld. Night falls softly over Guadalajara, as it once did so many years ago. The city glows with the same scattered lights, shimmering like distant stars against the darkened hills. Somewhere out there, the streets that once carried Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo's convoys still wind their way through quiet neighborhoods, but the man himself is no longer there. The house where he once stood by the window is either sold or abandoned, its rooms emptied of voices, its halls no longer echoing with the quiet footsteps of El Padrino. And yet, his presence still lingers, not in the walls, but in the memory of a time when one man sought to bring order to a world of shadows. As we return to this image, to the quiet mansion window where this story began, we find a different Miguel than the one who looked out over his empire in its prime. The man we see now is older, grayer, his body weakened by illness and the weight of decades. His hands, once steady with the authority of command, now tremble slightly as he lifts a glass of water. His eyes, once sharp and calculating, are clouded with age. And yet, the mind that built an empire is still there, reflecting, remembering, sifting through the choices and consequences that defined his life. Perhaps in these quiet moments, he thinks of Bella Vista, the dusty town of his childhood. He remembers the mornings when the roosters crowed and the air smelled of wet earth. He remembers the first time he wore a police uniform, the pride he felt stepping into a role of responsibility. He remembers the long nights of plotting, the meetings with Don Nato and Caro Quintero, the birth of the Guadalajara Cartel. He remembers the rise, the power, the calm order that once seemed unshakable. And he remembers the day it all began to unravel, the day the Americans came, the day he was taken away in silence. It is easy to see Miguel's story as a tragedy, but perhaps it is more accurate to see it as a cycle, a story of ambition, order, and inevitability. Every empire rises. Every empire falls. The Guadalajara Cartel was no different. Miguel brought together men who once fought each other, gave them a system, a vision, and for a time, he succeeded in taming chaos. But the very system he created made the trade stronger, richer, more powerful. When the center could no longer hold, the pieces scattered, and the chaos returned greater than before. For the listener lying in bed, eyes closed, the story of Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo is more than just a crime story. It is a meditation on power, on control, on the fleeting nature of order in a world that resists it. Miguel was not a saint, nor was he a simple villain. He was a man who believed he could shape the world to his will, who built something larger than himself, and who paid the price when the weight of it became too great. There is a certain calm in acknowledging this, in recognizing that even the most powerful figures are still human, still bound by the same laws of time and consequence as everyone else. The night deepens. The lights of Guadalajara continue to flicker, just as they did all those years ago. Somewhere beyond those lights, new bosses meet in secret, new deals are struck, new routes are plotted. The trade continues, relentless as the tide, and the system Miguel created still echoes in its structure. But the man himself has faded into history, his voice now a whisper, his image a fading photograph. The Godfather who once held Mexico's underworld in his hands has been reduced to a quiet figure, living out his final years in near solitude. There is something almost peaceful about this ending. No dramatic final gunfight, no betrayal in a hail of bullets, no roaring downfall. Just the slow passing of time, the quiet closing of a long and complicated life. In that stillness, one can almost imagine Miguel sitting once again by the window, not as a ruler but as a witness, watching the world he helped create, knowing it will go on without him. His empire has outlived him, but in a way, that was always the point. He did not build it to be temporary. He built it to last. And last it has, though not in the form he might have wished. As the story comes to an end, there is a sense of completion, of returning to where it all began. The boy from Bella Vista has lived his life, walked his path, and left his mark. His name will be remembered, debated, mythologized. Some will call him a genius, others a criminal, some both. But what cannot be denied is that he changed Mexico forever. His choices set into motion a chain of events that still shape the country's present. And though he is gone, the echoes of his empire still roll across the land like distant thunder. Now, as the night grows quiet and the last words of his story settle into stillness, it is time to let go. The mansion window stands open, the breeze moving softly through the room. The lights of Guadalajara shimmer in the distance, calm and unchanging. And the whisper of El Padrino, the man who built the first great cartel, fades into memory. His story, like the city itself, remains a reminder of ambition, of order, of the price of power, and of the truth that every empire, no matter how strong, eventually becomes a legend. Sleep comes easily now. The story has been told. The circle is complete. And somewhere, beyond the lights, beyond the hills, beyond the reach of law and history, the Godfather's voice falls silent at last.